So it's mid-October in 2020, and we're in the 6th or 7th month of the pandemic, and we're making a big effort to convert some curriculum that we would normally do live in tours of the city of Boston. So today we're going to be taking a walking tour of the South End. The South End is a remarkable example of several different types of housing and several different influences of American housing policy on changes in a city. In particular, several different eras of urban renewal impacted the choices for housing in the South End, as well as many different trends in the United States, such as the return from World War II, the Great Migration, changes in urban policy in Boston. So there's many great examples that we're going to be able to see today. We're here today with Vince O'Donnell, a longtime Boston housing advocate and a current advisor to the nonprofit organization Preservation for Affordable Housing. We're also joined by Danny LeBlanc, the former CEO of Somerville CDC. So we should have a lot of great information to squeeze into a short tour of the South End.
Hi, I'm Vince O'Donnell. Thank you, Neil. And thanks, Danny, for the opportunity to do this. We're standing in a plaza next to what's called Tent City Housing, and this is a 270-unit housing development that was built in the context of an urban renewal process. I think, based on what Neil said, what's really interesting here is that in the South End, we have lots of affordable housing, and it was built with different generations of programs. And all those generations of housing programs have built into them at some point a future where there might be a departure point where the affordability of the housing needs to be maintained and preserved. So this is what we're talking about today, is the preservation of this housing, not so much how it was created. But we are going to talk about Tent City briefly anyway, because a lot of affordable housing preservation was done in the context of community participation and oftentimes community struggle. And so we will tell those stories as we get to each place. Here at Tent City, this was born in struggle. After the demolition of existing housing, there was no replacement housing for a long time. And local South End community leader, really a leader for all of Boston, organized a tent city literally on this site, and as part of a long-standing community effort to get replacement housing. So eventually they succeeded, and this wonderful development was created, and a new owner was created, Tent City Development Corporation, which now owns and maintains this. And in a few minutes we'll get to a location where that same organization was able to help some other tenants preserve their own housing. We're now standing at Interfaith Haley House, a site, one of the 4 sites of this development, and it's owned as a joint venture by Madison Park Community Development Corporation and Haley House, a services organization. The story here is that this used to be a South End apartment building that was privately owned, and in the 1970s it was purchased by a standalone nonprofit housing developer called Interfaith Housing. Over time, this property failed financially and was foreclosed by HUD. HUD then sold it to the Boston Housing Authority, and after a number of years, the Boston Housing Authority decided that this wasn't really their strong suit, this kind of housing, and they put it on the market and sold it. That whole process, from starting when HUD sold to the Boston Housing Authority and then later when the Boston Housing Authority resold it, involved a lot of community work in which we were trying to persuade HUD to find a way within its rules not to sell to a slumlord, not to sell to a developer whose long-term interest was to get rid of the affordability. So it took a lot of community effort to work with HUD and then later with the Boston Housing Authority to structure those disposition processes and to make sure that not only were they sold to the right owner, but that there were adequate resources for the rehab of the property. So this property has actually gone through 2 federally financed rehabs. Then originally when Interfaith bought it, and then some 25 or so years later, when it needed recapitalization again, it also needed a new ownership structure. And that combination of recapitalization and ownership motivation are 2 really important keys to the preservation of this housing.
So Vince was talking about the importance that that interfaith played in saving this building and all this housing for the city of Boston. So the question that I have for you, Vince, is what role? Why did it matter that it was a nonprofit organization as opposed to a for-profit organization? What role did that play in saving this property?
That's a wonderful question, because there are really kind of 2 phases to it. When Interfaith bought the property, it was essentially derelict housing, and both for-profits and nonprofits were using the same HUD program, Section 236, to purchase and rehab these properties. The difference is the nonprofits' motivation was essentially for permanent affordability, and the for-profits, many of the for-profits actually worked hard to make sure that in the regulations and legislation that they had the right to terminate the affordability after 20 years. And that became the basis of one of the major waves of the preservation issue, which was I'll take your subsidy for as long as I want, and then when I'm done with it, I will stop taking your subsidy and I can return the property to market. So that was why it was important that Interfaith, the nonprofit, bought it. Nevertheless, that they failed as an organization, and that meant the property eventually failed financially. And that was why it was important to work with HUD to make sure that they sold it to another long-term affordable housing motivated owner. In that case, it was the Housing Authority. And again, the Housing Authority looked at the same mission issue, and when they sold the property, they could have sold to anybody, but they determined that it was in their best interest as a public body to sell to a nonprofit with a permanent affordability motive. So we have, over the years, we have actually understood that the nonprofit sector isn't big enough to do it all. So we've also worked into preservation programs, financial incentives, to make it attractive for-profit owners to keep these properties affordable. And I have to say, I'm very proud of the fact that in Massachusetts, we have actually made preservation of affordability a mission for a broader set of owners. And we've enacted legislation here called 40T, Chapter 40T, which actually makes transparent the process and the motives for purchasing properties and creates advantages for any owner who's intending to put long-term affordability requirements on any property that they purchase. We're standing in front of the Brownstones, a South End row house development. These units were purchased by a tenant organization that formed a nonprofit in the early 1990s. As I mentioned earlier, when affordable housing properties are developed by for-profit owners, they often have a point at which they can exit the program. And this was happening in the late 80s and early 90s through the prepayment of subsidized mortgages, mostly under what's called the Section 236 program. And this property had been developed by a private developer as affordable, and they took advantage. They wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to prepay the mortgage and convert the property to market rate housing, which would have displaced the tenants. A program was developed to address that problem. It was called the Low-Income Housing Preservation, LIPRA, Low-Income Housing Preservation and Resident Home Ownership Act. And LIPRA was a very powerful tool because it both provided financial resources for any nonprofit owner or tenant organization to purchase and fully rehab the property, and also, importantly, provided resources for the capacity development of the organization itself. And so in this case, the resident organization was a typical tenant organization that had these goals, but they didn't really have the wherewithal or the knowledge of developing, rehabbing, or owning housing. And through HUD provided resources, which channeled through local organizations here in Massachusetts. It was CDAC, Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation, which would they had HUD grants that they passed on to tenant organizations and to other nonprofits to create and develop sustainable ownership entities. And so through both the combination of the capital resources and the capacity building resources, this tenant organization was able to purchase this property. And if you look around this neighborhood, right next to it are condos that are selling for 7 figures. And that's a program now which will permanently allow this to remain as affordable. The use restriction on this and other LIPRA properties is that it must remain affordable for the longer of 50 years or the useful life of the property. So that's what is permanent, is that you can make it with any kind of government program.
So at the beginning of the tour, we talked about how many great examples the South End provides for changes in housing over the 20th century. But it's important to realize that this neighborhood at one time didn't even exist. In the transition from the 1800s into the 1900s, Boston was a very small city. And across the 19th century, we grew from a city of some 25 to 30,000 to almost 100,000. And then in the 20th century, we grew from 100,000 to 800,000. So there were lots of population growth pressures that were happening on the city. And at the very beginning, Boston didn't have all the land mass that it has now. And the South End is the perfect example of how Boston expanded by infill. So in about 1850, the South End started to be filled in. The marshland that was part of Boston Harbor was filled in across the late part of the 1800s and into the 1900s to form the neighborhood that we're touring today.
So now we're standing at Warren Avenue Apartments. In many ways, this is similar to the brownstones. Obviously, it's physically similar. The same generation of South End brownstone row house. Also the same program. This was also owned by a private owner who had rehabbed it in the 70s under the Section 236 program and wanted to get out of the program and go to market. So in this instance, the same program was used, the LIPRA program, and the same tenant organizing and tenant capacity building process was used with HUD funds that were funneled through CDAC. But it took a slightly different direction in terms of the ultimate owner. In this case, the owner is a partnership entity between the tenant organization and 10 City Development Corporation that we looked at before. So here you have an instance of 10 City Corporation being created out of conflict in the 60s and the failure of urban renewal to meet people's needs, and then the community saying, well, we'll do it, and creating this development organization. But then they went beyond their own footprint and reached out to assist other tenants at a time when there was this crisis of affordability. So this partnership is a really durable one. Tent City lives on as a viable entity and continues to provide support for the tenants. And the housing itself under the LIPRA program, as I was saying before, is essentially permanently affordable. And that raises an interesting question. If it's permanently affordable, if it were, let's say, a housing co-op, the question might come up, can the tenants, when they move out, gain some appreciation and value and take it with them when they move? And this is not a housing co-op. There's no stock. It's purely nonprofit. But there's a spectrum from free appreciation to be had upon sale, which is typically in a market unregulated situation, all the way down to no appreciation whatsoever. It's permanently affordable with no equity taken out by anybody. And that's the case here under the LIPRA program. And somewhere in the middle are things that we call limited equity co-ops, in which there is a possibility of some financial upside for tenants who are also shareholders in a co-op. And we'll see that a little bit later at Meth Union Manor Co-op.
So here we are in front of the Warren Avenue Apartments. Vince just described how these were developed over time. But as we were walking away, we had a discussion about what was the impact on the neighborhood here of this transition or this transformation, as well as other transformation that were taking place in the neighborhood. Could you explain more about how the HUD investment in preserving affordable housing impacts the market?
Sure. Essentially what we discovered when we had this issue arise that owners wanted to prepay subsidized mortgages and convert to market in a rather simple way, we discovered that it's pretty complicated, because a lot of advocates thought, well, what we can just do is maybe legislate that the owners can't take the equity out after all. And that ran into some pretty serious objections and really constitutional issues of taking private property without compensation. And so it kind of established a basic principle of housing preservation, which is that if you want to continue to preserve the affordability of a piece of real estate, you have to pay the owner what it's worth first. And those resources have to come from the federal government. And that's a bedrock principle. So it may sound expensive, but it's actually less expensive than new construction. And that's kind of one of the things that we learned in that process. And so each one of these preservation transactions also represents a flow of equity, mostly from private resources, to the previous owner. And that previous owner can do what they want. They can buy a boat. Right around the corner from here is an example of a luxury condo in which the developer of that condo was the former owner of our next stop, Castle Square Apartments. And in a preservation transaction, that former owner of Castle Square was able to derive an enormous equity takeout, which was based on his market value, and he chose to invest that equity in the very same neighborhood across the street to develop luxury condos, which also illustrates the fact that putting affordable housing or preserving affordable housing in a neighborhood does not tear down the neighborhood. It actually can enhance the neighborhood. And the fact that he chose to put his equity right across the street is living proof of that. We're in one of the courtyards at Castle Square. Castle Square is a 500-unit development that was built in the late 60s, and also under a program where its mortgage was prepayable and the owner had the choice to opt out and go to market. In this case, the original owner had planned to sell the property to another private developer, and that private developer, it turns out, needed a number of governmental approvals in order to assemble the resources to rehab the property, which it dearly needed. And the developer, I think wisely, realized that those public resources would be more forthcoming if they had the support of the tenant organization. And so they actually made an offer to the tenant organization that after 15 years, the tenant organization could have what's called a right of first refusal to purchase the property if he ever put it up for sale again. And entered into a negotiation with the tenants to offer them that. And the tenants went to a number of supporting organizations, including Greater Boston Legal Services and again CDAC, and built a team of advisors. And what turned into a simple offer, what began as a simple offer turned into a lengthy negotiation process. And at the outcome of that process, the tenants wound up being a joint venture owner with the private developer, was Wind Development. And Castle Square Tenants Organization was a 49% owner of this property when it was purchased and redeveloped back in the early 90s.
So Vince, you're talking about the structure of the deal and what's happened historically. So my question is, who lives here now, and what income levels does this property serve?
Yep. And
what are the funding programs that maintain this property?
That's a really interesting question, because this is an interesting place. First of all, demographically, this property probably is about 70% Chinese Americans and maybe 20% African American and other white folks and other ethnicities. So it's a pretty diverse organization. This is really right across the turnpike from Chinatown, which is one reason that there's so much of an Asian population. Income-wise, it was created for families earning incomes up to 80%, and it is family housing. However, it has become intergenerational housing, and there are lots and lots of elderly households or households with a mix of generations in them. Also embedded in this physically, but not part of it, is a senior property owned by the Boston Housing Authority called Eva White that's about to be redeveloped, but it really is not legally connected to Castle Square. So so it was built for people making less than 80% of area median income, but it actually serves people all the way down to extremely low incomes, because a very large percentage of the units, maybe about 70% of the units, are assisted by project-based Section 8. So the population that's able to use a Section 8 subsidy ranges from extremely low income up to maybe 50% of area median. And so we have a real diversity here of income and ethnicity. So when the project was first purchased by this joint venture of WIN and the Castle Square Tenants Organization, in addition to the fact that equity flowed to the seller, the other reality was that the Castle Square Tenant Organization itself was capitalized with funds that flowed from the transaction. So they started out with a nest egg of several $1 million, and wisely they decided to put that money, which was their own to use for anything that fit their charitable purpose. That's a 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit. They put that money into a trust fund that required approval of not only the tenant organization's board, but also outside trustees to invest that money and to spend that money on charitable purpose. Flash forward some years later, 20 or more years later, the property has been recapitalized one more time, and that resulted in a flip. So the tenants are now the 51% controlling owner of the joint venture. It's still a joint venture, but the tenants now are the majority owner, and the property is going through a refinancing that's fueled by the extremely high Section 8 rents here. And what they're doing with that money is they're going to pay off all the public debt that supported the original transaction. They're going to do another, I think, $15 million of additional rehab that's needed, for some of which is infrastructure work. And then they're going to take out some actual cash equity that will be split between the partners, and the tenants will now have over $20 million in unrestricted net assets. This is unheard of with a tenant organization having an asset base that large. And the tenants are expanding the trust to include more outside trustees and developing new purposes for the trust. It'll essentially be able to act both as an engine to supply funds for Castle Square Tenant Organization, which has a host of social and educational programs that they're currently managing, and also to become essentially a mini foundation to provide support for other affordable housing and other social development programs run by other nonprofits in the Boston area. Now we're standing in front of Cathedral Housing, which is public housing development owned by the Boston Housing Authority. This is really kind of a classic style of public housing. It was built on land that was actually cleared back in early 40s, 1941, but it wasn't actually developed until sometime later. And it was developed using the federal public housing program, and so its owner is the Boston Housing Authority. So the preservation issue that we've talked about so far has to do with maintaining long-term affordability in the face of various threats, including market conversion, but also the other kinds of threats to the continued affordability of these properties is the adequate resources to maintain them and to modernize them over time. So something built this long ago that's housing large poor families may not be physically the best environment for continuing to serve today's families. Codes have changed, standards have changed in terms of size of apartments and availability of space for services. So public housing, even though it's permanently affordable as owned by a public entity, still needs to go through a preservation cycle. And today, the way that that is being done is getting more and more interesting and complicated. And although in the first part of its history, the public housing program was entirely funded within the ownership structure of public housing authorities, it is now able to capitalize on private resources as well. So more and more housing authorities like the BHA are using hybrid forms of financing and ownership. So a typical redevelopment of a conventional public housing authority property today would entail a combination of activities such as leasing the land to a private developer, which might be a nonprofit or a for-profit or a joint venture like the Castle Square, and that new ownership entity would be subject to various regulatory agreements and requirements for affordability. And as I say, the land would still be owned and controlled by the housing authority, and they're free then to go out in the market and get the same private resources, public resources, that private owners can get for other properties like Castle Square, and including the low-income housing tax credit program. And so that is actively being done all over the city. One other feature that's being done with the redevelopment of public housing is that as neighborhoods get stronger economically, it is possible to have a mix of incomes in these properties. If you can add additional units and increase the density, have higher income folks live in a mixed income situation and actually have that drive some of the economics of the rehab of the lower income units. And so those kinds of mixed income hybrid developments are being done now, starting with this very straightforward public housing model.
So as the 20th century unfolded, the South End became a relatively segregated black neighborhood in Boston, and there were a number of developments that were developed as just black developments. What was the history of Cathedral and other developments in this part of the city related to segregation?
Well, I mean, at that time, this is a great example of the government participating in segregation, and this was essentially developed intended to be for an all-black population. Elsewhere in the city, the Boston Housing Authority had similar public housing, the same program, the same physical structures for all white populations. And that was accepted, and it wasn't until, I'm not sure when the lawsuit was, but probably in the 70s, that the BHA was then under a court order to desegregate, as they should have happened a long time ago. So yeah, it was actually part and parcel of government policy.
So the 20th century had the 20th century had various times of urban renewal, and it resulted in a lot of new opportunity for real estate development in Boston and in the South End. But it also gave rise to other social trends. In particular, it was one of the driving forces behind white flight in the city of Boston. And also, simultaneously, there was a lot of immigration that was happening and a lot of migrant groups. And during the civil rights era, there was a push towards more power towards immigrant groups, migrant groups, minority groups. And one of the great development organizations in Boston was born out of that era. Vince, can you tell us a little bit more about IBA and how they came to be?
Yep. So by the late 60s, the early 70s, there had been a significant influx of folks from Puerto Rico into the South End, and so there was a large Puerto Rican community here. And at the time that the BRA was starting to clear land for urban renewal, there was no clear plan for a replacement of that housing. Exactly the same situation as we talked about over at Tent City. In this case, the community where this particular demolition was going to happen was heavily Puerto Rican, and that community organized first to oppose the demolition and to be able to have more participation in the planning process. Eventually, what happened was they actually were able to get development rights for these parcels, and some of which had not been demolished, and they were able to go to that same program, this Section 236 program, and get resources for the rehabilitation of those properties. And across the street we have one of those properties. It's a package, again a scattered site, and so they did a rehab of that, and a very fairly simple ownership structure that they used, but it did have some new bells and whistles, where they actually did engage with some private investors, and using a program in effect, then they were able essentially to sell some of the depreciation, paper depreciation rights, to attract capital from private developers on a small scale. It helped fill the gaps in the program. Anyway, 20 years later, they weren't looking to go to market, but the property, as any property does after 20 years, needed some refreshing and some additional rehab. And they were at that time able to use that same LIPRA program to get new resources to refresh the property. It turned out that the process of getting the new resources and dealing with the new financing requirements, and dealing with some of the tenant participation requirements, actually put some stress on the organization. And there was quite a bit of conflict internally about who was going to control the rehab process and who was going to control the management of the property going forward. So this organization kind of went through a bit of a crisis at that point, and happily was able to, with some mediation, resolve that, and kind of resolve some of the ethnic tensions that were actually built into the organization from the beginning. And so that strengthened the organization as well as strengthened the property. IBA has gone on to actually, even before this preservation transaction under LIPRA, IBA went on not just to become the developer of this one property, but become a major model for community-controlled development. And so they have done numerous other developments right in this area, new construction for families, and down the street there's twin towers that are owned by the Boston Housing Authority as public housing for seniors, but the management of the public housing is done by IBA, so that there's a kind of a community consistency about this whole thing. And there's a wonderful plaza that's there for community events. And so this is a really vibrant neighborhood, built really essentially by its own community with these federal resources.
So Vince, we're standing here in the middle of this development, and you can get a sense for the size of this part of the city that was once upon a time cleared. IBA has done so much work in this part of the city. What's behind all these different developments?
Sure. Well, this particular one is the first family housing development they did. They called it Via Victoria. And there's actually a Via Victoria 1 and 2, two different phases of family housing that they did. And basically, as I was saying, the organization reached a point, having done the first acquisition and rehab, where they had the recognition and they had the experience where they could go on and develop new housing. And in fact, they did this long enough ago that this housing we're looking at right now has already been through one preservation transaction of its own, in the sense that they have successfully replaced the original investors who partnered with them, and recapitalized under it's just a normal recapitalization cycle without the crisis of affordability, because the owner here is committed to permanent affordability. As IBA has built out and strengthened its organization, it's added depth in the form of resident services. And here we are at the Via Victoria Plaza, and right at the offices where IBA has a technology center, a youth development center, and resident services. And because of all that robust human service component of IBA, they were chosen by the Boston Housing Authority to do the property management on the senior high-rise development, which is in the same plaza here. So it kind of illustrates the sort of broad breadth of the organization, and just frankly, from an organizational standpoint, it also illustrates kind of diversifying their income sources, which gives them more financial security for the future. So now we're standing in front of one of the properties that's owned by Tenants Development Corporation, or TDC. TDC is a mutual housing association in the sense that the properties are all controlled by one central nonprofit. The governance of that central nonprofit is limited to tenants who live in the properties that are owned and controlled by that nonprofit. So they own actually 3 different affordable housing properties. Each of them has a separate ownership entity, but each of those entities is controlled by TDC, the sort of parent or sponsor. And that sponsor is exclusively controlled by the residents who live there. So that's a very interesting model, and like other things that we've seen today, TDC's ability to be an owner of this residential real estate in the South End was born in struggle. In this case, the properties that are in this portfolio were essentially in serious deterioration, and the owner of the property was unable or unwilling to improve the property conditions. And so the tenants were really organizing against the owner and looking for allies. And interestingly, the primary ally that they found that kind of made the big difference was that they went to a rabbinical court and said that this owner was bringing shame on the community, and asked the rabbinical court if they could intervene, and they actually did. And they ordered the owner to settle with the tenants, including selling to them. And so there was a mediation process, and everybody walked away satisfied, and the TDC then was the owner of this property. Again, they turned to the federal Section 236 program for funds to rehab it, and with the help of outside consultants, they were able to do that. Well, flash forward another 15 or 20 years, and this property, which had a very healthy amount of project-based Section 8 to help its rent stream while it's still serving very low-income people, although it had that steady rent stream, the condition of the property had deteriorated, and the tenants realized that they needed a substantial rehab, and it reached the point where HUD was threatening to terminate the Section 8 contract for failure to perform. That was a real crisis. The tenants reached out again to other allies, including Mel King, who was right around the corner from here, and very close by, and asked a number of allies how they could find the resources to rehab the property, which at that point probably needed close to $10 million worth of rehab. The answer they got back from their friends was that nobody's going to give you the money as a grant. Nobody's going to make it easy the way it was in the Section 236 days. The most likely avenue for them to get financing was through what's the low-income housing tax credit program, which for a tenant organization that was not really involved in any kind of other housing development activity at that point was a real stretch. Conceptually, it was felt like taking a risk. It felt like taking on partners who had no common interest with them, and they were very concerned. But again, in talking with their allies, Mel and folks from CDAC, they got a good development team, consultant team together, and were able to refinance the properties to raise the money for the rehab under the low-income housing tax credit program, with all the protections that anybody could think of at that time in terms of maintaining their complete control over the property at some time in the future when the investor partners no longer had an interest in the property. Well, now 15 years later, it's time for that investor to leave. And the TDC portfolio is experiencing a problem that, in spite of everything that we all did to essentially make their documents with their investor bulletproof in terms of protecting TDC's long-term interests, The investor, in the meantime, has shifted its control to new players. Same investor, new owners of the investor, if you were, and they're now in a very difficult struggle with the investor owner, the investor partner, about the future control of the property. So they're in good company. There are lots of organizations around the country who are dealing with the same problem, and we're hoping for a successful outcome. But this does illustrate the fact that preservation comes in waves. The problems emerge in waves, and there are sort of generations of not only production, but generations of preservation issues, and TDC represents that. We're now at Meth Union Manor Co-op. This actually illustrates one of the first preservation problems to emerge, which was physical failure and foreclosure, followed by redevelopment by a responsible owner. Meth Union Manor was developed under a predecessor of the 236 program by Union Methodist Church in this neighborhood. And like a lot of other churches and synagogues, the HUD affordable housing development programs were made available to those organizations. The housing itself was, of course, secular, but the sponsors were congregations, and those entities were eager to step up to the plate, but also were not sophisticated, experienced developers. And so in the production wave of the late 60s and early 70s, many of those properties failed physically and financially. And and that was not limited to nonprofits. The for-profit and nonprofit properties had a high rate of failure, resulting in HUD foreclosure. Well, the tenants who lived here became aware that the property was going to be foreclosed by HUD. And they also became aware that under the rules in effect at that time, if HUD foreclosed the property, it just became a piece of government property that had to be resold, and the fiduciary duty in the resale of the property was to the Treasury of the United States. That is, there were no restrictions on how the property was going to be used, and it was to be auctioned to the highest bidder. The tenants, of course, could see in that a formula for displacement. And so they went to then Senator Ed Brooke, who was on the Senate Finance Committee, which essentially writes authorizing legislation for housing programs. And with Senator Brooke's help, they were able to secure passage of what I would think of as landmark legislation, which gave HUD the duty to maintain the property as long as they owned it or controlled it, and to sell it to a responsible party. But not only that, but in the sale to a private party, to do all they could to work with the tenants in the property and with local organizations and with the city to ensure the future affordability. And HUD also provided resources in the form of project-based Section 8 to guarantee the affordability. So with all that essentially mandate that was created, it started with these tenants' activism. The tenants actually did buy the property, and they chose to form as their ownership entity a housing cooperative. It was a limited equity housing cooperative, which means that in a housing cooperative, any housing cooperative works such that the tenants who live there each own shares in a corporation, and the corporation owns the real estate. So unlike a condo, the tenants do not own their unit. They own a share of the corporation, and the corporation owns the entire property. And when tenants leave, they sell their shares to the new tenant, to the new owner coming in, or the new shareholder coming in. And because it's a limited equity co-op, that means there's a limited amount of appreciation in the shares. So the tenants can take out some equity, but the amount they can take out is limited. If it were unlimited, then the tenant coming in, or the shareholder coming in, would have to have a higher income to be able to afford to purchase that share. So it only works as a continued low-income property if the value of the share is limited. So that's been happening now since they began their effort to purchase the property in 1978, and they probably bought the property in the early mid-80s, 1983 or 4 or so, maybe a little bit earlier. And they also had a really robust training program and capacity building program to help them understand how to be a housing co-op. There are other housing co-ops in the Boston area, and they met with some of their counterparts in these other properties, and they really learned how to run a cooperative organization. They have third-party private management, professional management, to help them stay on the right side of all the regulations, and this is a smashing success. That they have recapitalized several times, and they have never used these other financing mechanisms such as long-term housing tax credit program. They've always been able to just simply leverage the Section 8 rents, which again are so healthy in the South End, and use that to leverage enough debt to meet their ongoing rehab needs. So for me, I think one of the takeaways here is that the South End had become a community of low-income people, minorities, who were living under very difficult conditions. And as the South End became more attractive to other people with more resources, those folks were at risk of displacement. And the whole story of preservation, it really circles around their ability to stay in this neighborhood. And it's really only through the federal, state, and city resources that have been provided that they're able to remain in this community and be part of its vibrancy. So that's, I think, the most important part of what we do in this affordable housing preservation work.
So the Corcoran Center really likes to take advantage of experts in the city and bring them into the classroom and bring students out into the city whenever we can. At this time, during the pandemic, it's more difficult. So we're trying our best to look for opportunities like this to bring experts into the classroom through video. Today, we'd like to thank Vince O'Donnell for sharing his expertise and his experience in the city of Boston and with all the housing in the South End. And we'd also like to thank Danny LeBlanc for organizing this class and taking so much time and effort to share his experience with our students also. Thanks so much, and we hope that this video is helpful for you in understanding the complicated and interesting history of affordable housing in Boston.